All right. Looks like it's connecting. Taking a little longer than I would expect. All right. Looks like we're live on YouTube. And as I said, welcome to episode number 70 of Wednesday Night Live. And as I said, I titled this False Beliefs in Human Health. And essentially, we're going to be talking about three things. The first is certain false beliefs or things that lead doctors astray when evaluating patients, so that you can be aware of these and realize that there is a lot of things that go into a patient evaluation. The second part is going to be talking about what are called, again, cognitive biases that make certain studies. Oh, we're having trouble with sound. Okay. Let me see if, let me connect. Okay, can everyone hear me? Just type into the box if you can hear me. Can everyone hear me? Terry, I am getting okays from everyone else. I'm not sure why your computer is not hearing. I'm sorry, everyone else is hearing just okay, it seems. Thanks, Ryan and Patrick and Lewis, for mentioning that. Okay, you could go to YouTube, yeah. Thanks, Dave. Welcome, Dave. Okay, so Terry's gonna go over to listen on YouTube, and we'll get started. So essentially, three things that we're going to be talking about tonight. The first thing that we're going to be talking about is basically some things that make patient encounters difficult or can lead doctors astray. That's the first thing. Second is how studies can really come out in all different kinds of ways, and the results can be very biased based on various different things, just so you have a better conception of how you really have to be careful with the study you decide to pick to verify your beliefs, or to find out or to determine your own beliefs. And then we're going to go into false beliefs that people have that I learned from a teacher by the name of Dr. Robert Rondell Gibson. These are basically more about life in general. And either you'll be infuriated by them, or you'll find them humorous, or they'll make you mad. It'll be, or you just will think that they're nonsense. So I look forward to sharing some of those. This doctor by the name of Dr. Robert Rondell Gibson came up with a whole list of these that he suggested that people sort of experiment with, so to determine whether they're real or not, or true or not. And I like sharing them. I find them to be fun and humorous, but some people think of them in other ways. So we'll see how you feel about them. So we'll start with the more scientific section, and then move on to these sort of beliefs about life in general. So let's jump into what are called the cognitive biases. So the first one I wanted to discuss is something called confirmation bias. And this is basically listening selectively only to evidence that fits your opinion. And obviously we have that happening in our world today, not just in science, but in just about everything. We often have a certain opinion, and we research our opinion, and there's, with social media and with all the access to information that we have at our fingertips, isn't it amazing that we can find more information about what we feel to believe is the truth? And that has bred a whole host of people who basically just continue researching and finding evidence that fits their own opinion. An example would be people who are believe in flat Earth theory. They're, believe it or not, are thousands upon thousands of people who believe that the Earth is flat. And if you go on YouTube, you can find hours and hours and hours of supposedly scientific information that will confirm your beliefs. And so you can get into, obviously, as a lot of the news media have spoken about, sort of these narrow windows of people self-isolating themselves and just listening selectively to evidence that fits the opinion that you have. But this can also happen with doctors as well. Sometimes when a diagnosis is made, that shuts out all other thought. The diagnosis, in a lot of times with in medicine, basically results in the end of investigation. And sometimes things are not so clear cut, and therefore some doctors fall into this confirmation bias where a diagnosis may have been made, and then all of the evidence and labs that can support and contribute to that diagnosis are really focused on more than things that may not be the case. And therefore, this is something that can happen as well with doctors in seeing patients. And believe it or not, Francis Bacon, who lived in the 1600s. I think I believe he was lived around the time of Shakespeare. I think Shakespeare was around that time, and he's famous for the quote, "Knowledge is power." Very famous man of letters in the UK. And in 1602, here's a quote that he wrote about confirmation bias. He wrote, "Once a man's understanding has settled on something, it draws everything else to support and agree with it. And if it encounters a larger number of more powerful countervailing examples, it either fails to notice them or disregards them, or makes fine distinctions to dismiss and reject them. And all this with much dangerous prejudice to preserve the authority of its first conception." So this is something that has been known for quite a while, that people are not exactly rational when they've made a firm conclusion about something, and they just listen to things that support this conclusion. And so a lot of thinkers have actually pointed out the fact that when you make a conclusion, that actually shuts off all further investigation. And that conclusion that you make, whether it's about a person or an event or whatever, or in the case of a doctor making a diagnosis, that shuts off any further investigation. And so therefore, it can be a negative thing and can lead us down a path that is not true. And when I came across that quote, I looked into just reviewing some of Francis Bacon's other quotes. He has some really amazing ones that I'll just, as a diversion, just share with you. Of course, we know knowledge is power. He's also credited with the remedy is worse than the disease. We certainly know that being the case with certain medical treatments. He wrote, "Reading maketh a full man, conference a ready man, and writing an exact man." This one I like. "Truth is the daughter of time, not of authority." I really like that because that actually appeals to another bias, which is the appeal to authority. It's called the appeal to authority, where someone will make a statement that is, and his support for that is because such and such an expert said it. And of course, we're seeing that in the news all the time with people who are propped up as authorities, and therefore, and then when someone has to render an opinion, they just say, well, such and such said X. And that doesn't do anything. Obviously, there are people who are authorities, but you have to investigate whether they're an authority or not. You can't allow other people to set others up as an authority and then follow anything that they have to say. So anyway, truth is the daughter of time, not of authority. I like that quote. This is another great one. "Money makes a good servant, but a bad master." I think that's fabulous. And the final one that I really liked is, nature to be commanded must be obeyed. And I think that really fits quite well with human health, actually, that in order for us to have some level of control over our own health, we have to understand the rules of nature. Okay, so we've talked about confirmation bias now, about how, and I think all of you see that happening, especially in the political realm. So I don't think we need to, and obviously there are lots of scientific controversies that we're dealing with the COVID situation. And we're seeing this sort of thing where people are falling into very well-defined camps based on firm conclusions that aren't necessarily based on firm science. And that goes for both sides, no question about it. Okay, the next is called anchoring bias. Anchoring bias is somewhat similar in the sense that it's also prioritizing information, but based on initial impressions. So one of the things that I have to sometimes, like if I have a medical student following me around seeing patients, or if my nurse is presenting, both my nurse and say a medical student, both have seen a fair number of cases, and they may have come up with a conclusion, a diagnosis on their own before I've walked into the room. And therefore, their reporting of what they saw has actually been influenced by the conclusion they made based on what they think is the diagnosis. And so from that point on, it's going to be difficult for them to be able to differentiate. Whereas for me, I've also had some anchoring that's just taken place in the sense that I've been given a presentation on this particular patient that I have yet to walk into the room on, and a diagnosis has already been inferred, if not outright reported by either the medical student or the nurse that's working with me. And so I could fall into that and prioritize all the findings of my examination based on what was told to me. So that's basically what's called anchoring bias. And I think in life, we also have this situation, notwithstanding the obvious, feeling that first impressions are lasting, right? And sometimes first impressions are quite accurate. So I'm not necessarily saying that that's a false thing, but that sometimes we make, again, these conclusions which shut off any kind of further thought about it, and everything else thereafter is prioritized based on this initial feeling. Okay, next is what's called the affect heuristic. And this is when emotions sway your ability to make rational decisions. Very obvious that our emotions are going to sway things. And sometimes these emotions are based on firm feelings that we have about certain things. So this is something that can also sway us, where emotions can play a role. This leads to another bias, which is called biases of rhetoric. And these are where you're appealing to emotions, as well as to what I like to describe as ideals of behavior. Now, there have been a lot of documentaries that have come out over the last, well, forever, quite frankly, that show a certain type of lifestyle, like whether it's vegan or carnivore, or there's all these kinds of eating styles, and they all have these documentaries that are there to support them. And documentaries in general are really one of the most, I would say, they're the most, well, they're certainly persuasive. I guess I'm forgetting the word. Just they're the most biased. That's probably the way it is. When I was in college, I was actually a psychology major, and my minor was in film, and I took a couple classes just on documentaries. And there are so many ways to sway an audience. And what's happening now in these documentaries is that they're appealing to an ideal, and the ideal may not be a verifiable scientific outcome. In other words, I don't have anything wrong with someone choosing to be vegan at all. It can be a very healthy way of living. I have nothing against vegans. But if you're trying to convince me to be a vegan by convincing me that it is some sort of human ideal, that this is the way we were designed to be, and therefore this is going to usher in a new age, that is a type of bias of rhetoric that is essentially opposed the verifiable facts. And what you'll find in those particular documentaries is what we spoke about before, which is confirmation bias, as well as anchoring biases, where you are prioritizing all the kinds of feelings, beliefs, facts, selectively choosing studies that are going to confirm to this ideal of behavior. And whenever we're pursuing a certain sort of ideal, it doesn't necessarily mix with reality. Okay, so let's keep on moving. Next is outcome bias. It's called the outcome bias. And by the way, there's an amazing website. It's called catalogofbias.org, and it goes through all the different scientific biases. There's probably 50 or 60 of them. I'm just covering a select set just to show you how things can really, really be difficult to come to real, understandable, and verifiable conclusions that aren't tainted by all these biases. Okay, so outcome bias. So this is a tendency to evaluate a decision based on its outcome. In other words, let's give an example of if there's a 50-50 chance of a medicine working or not working, okay? And if I give you that medicine, and I know that there's a rough probability of 50% of patients improve, 50% of patients don't. If I give it to you and you get better, then you're going to say that I made the right decision and that I'm a good doctor. But in fact, that's not necessarily the case, because I already knew beforehand that there was a 50-50 chance. Now, what if there was a failure? In other words, what if you were in the other half of people that there's nothing that happens? Then you would probably say, well, he doesn't know what he's talking about. And so this also impacts the evaluation of improvement of how a doctor improves their performance. In other words, so if you did well, the doctor might say, oh, wow, I was great. I'm a great doctor. That patient got better. That ignores the fact that 50% of people don't improve. So where does a doctor learn to improve his performance? And the answer to that lies in how did he make that decision? What were the factors that led up to the decision to choose this medication over another medication in the context of all the other medical problems and in the context of supporting evidence? That is how a doctor improves over time, by looking at how they make the decisions. When in fact, obviously you have to look at outcomes, but if you're basing everything on the outcome, when we already know that certain medicines work a certain percentage of the time, looking at it from a medical perspective, you can't use that to improve your medical care. You have to look at the decision-making analysis, not necessarily the outcome. So that can be very subtle for doctors. Don't necessarily think about that too often. They just think, well, the patients got better and therefore I'm a great doctor. And when in fact, some of those outcomes are just related to a certain set of probabilities, which leads me to really think about this concept of cause and effect. And ultimately, it's not really, we tend to always think that we live in this cause and effect world, but what we really live in is a cause that can lead to a probability that an effect is going to take place. And therefore, it's often more valuable to look at life, just, I think, in general, of course, it's just my opinion, to look at life as more of a probability, a set of probabilities that may or may not happen. Obviously, probability means there could be a larger tendency for higher probability, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it is a one-to-one cause and effect relationship. And we often we're sort of conditioned to believe that we live in a cause and effect world. And of course there are causes, but again, the outcomes are more in the realm of probabilities than they are of 100% effects. And of course, when it comes to human health, with just the complexity of the body and just the impact of the mind over the body and all of the systems that are interacting in the body, I think you can get to a better appreciation of why thinking in terms of probabilities is much better. Certainly, when it comes to doctors who are giving people, and I've mentioned this before, you have you're going to die in 6 months. These sorts of declarative, statements are symptomatic of sort of a cause and effect thinking, when in fact, of course, we don't know what the future holds. And therefore, we can only think in terms of probabilities as a reality, quite frankly. And when we fall back into this cause leading to 100% effect, it really leads us down a very depressing and pessimistic view of the way the world actually, what I feel, the way the world actually behaves. Next is availability bias. I'm watching my time because I want to get through all of these. So availability bias is basing decisions on ease of finding examples. There are certain things that are just easy to find examples, and therefore you can make false conclusions. We spoke about biases of rhetoric. There's another bias called centripetal bias, which is where the bias affects a number of examples because people seek a certain person or organization out. So in other words, I'll give you an example of something that I see quite frequently. I listen to a lot of podcasts, and there are certain podcast hosts, health-wise, that are medical doctors, but they don't see patients, and they espouse a certain, what I mentioned before, they espouse a certain view of an ideal way of eating. And they get all kinds of emails from people who are basically drawn to them because they have the same belief, and they're also seeing health improvements based on that. Now that is typical of a centripetal bias, meaning these say podcast doctors who have these shows expressing these views, they're attracting to them a certain type of person. And if they state that their ideal way of eating, living, etc., is great for people because they get emails every day from people saying that they've improved. This is what's called centripetal bias, because they are attracting a certain type of person. And I always say that if you're listening to a certain doctor and they don't see patients, then that is basically when you see patients, reality tends to hit you in the face with any kind of preconceived notions that you may have. So Jennifer's saying in philosophy, logic, and law, these are called fallacies of argument. Thank you for that. Then there's one called data dredging bias. This is just where they look through the studies and they basically just try to find statistical things that they may not have even thought of them beforehand. And here they have a study, and there's also what's called a publication bias, where they may not be, they're not publishing the negative results. There's been a shift in medical literature in general to actually start publishing more negative results, because of course it's valuable to know when something didn't work, but still there is this publication bias where negative results are really not published obviously to the same number as regular ones. So they go through all the numbers, they hand it to potentially a statistician to try to find some sort of connection. And these connections, while they may be, quote, statistically significant, may have absolutely no relevance whatsoever, and may not actually even be correct in any way. So that is something that happens. There's something called the Hawthorne effect, which is where people behave differently when they're being observed. Example given is, if there's a study to see when people are washing their hands, they're going to be washing their hands more if they're being watched. That's sort of something that is seen. There's what's called hot stuff bias, which is basically inappropriate publication. based on hot topics, trendy ideas, these sorts of things. And unfortunately, sometimes less sensitive studies that at a period of normal time wouldn't be published end up getting published. And the importance of getting published, of course, is that there are a lot of incentives. There's always a lot of pressure on all kinds of scientists to get things published. And therefore, it can lead to trends, can lead people into publishing things that will get approved, but not with the rigor of the analysis and the review and the vetting of that particular study could be actually less sensitive. Many of you have heard of sponsorship bias, so drug companies that will sponsor a study, and that doesn't necessarily mean that the study is completely invalidated. Unfortunately, I see a lot of that where the second that people see that it's been sponsored by a company, that it's automatically not listened to. You have to review these studies with the same rigor that you would review any other study, with the acknowledgement going into it that there is the potential for sponsorship bias. Now, in medical school and residency, what we do is we have what's called a journal club. And in the journal club, we take an article, and for an hour or two, we just go through all these biases, and we tear the thing apart. And quite frankly, in order to really get a firm conclusion, I shouldn't use that word conclusion, but a firm idea of what's really happening, if this is something that's worth further investigating. I mean, think about what really has to be done is we can take a very simple study, and we can spend an hour or two in a journal club really tearing this thing apart. And you end up analyzing these things, almost line by line, examining the graphs and really investigating these things in a very, very deep way. And at the end of some of these, you just want to throw some of them completely in the trash. Unfortunately, there is an unfortunate trend that I see, especially on YouTube, where people are just reading the abstracts, which is the summary of the study, without actually going into the study. And then using this, of course, most of this being confirmation bias, looking for evidence to support their belief instead of investigating the belief itself. That is essentially, it's just not enough. You cannot look at an abstract and make any reasonable conclusion without having to go through a firm analysis of this. But as you know, as we now know, if you're working from the lens of confirmation bias, you've already made up your decision, and you're just sort of picking out abstracts that sort of fit your view. It's completely useless, unfortunately, and that's basically what's happening. I think PubMed, which you can pull up the abstracts, is a remarkable advance, and I believe that everyone should have complete open access to all these studies. Unfortunately, just because you can get the abstract doesn't mean you can get the full article. And then the full article, it takes time. When we in medical school and residency, when I first encountered Journal Club, I couldn't believe it. The reason I couldn't believe it goes to one of the false beliefs that Dr. Robert Rundell Gibson came up with, which is basically, the false belief is that I believe that I can understand anything in the language from which I grew up in. A lot of us work on that. We function thinking that way, and therefore, if it's on PubMed, we can read the abstract and read the conclusion, that we are capable of making a firm decision about what the authority of this particular article is. And that is also a false belief, because again, I was flabbergasted by seeing one of my attendings who's been reading these articles for 20, 30 years, and they can just spot things that I just read right by, and they basically destroy the entire paper. And you're like, oh my God, I didn't even see that. Like, it's obvious now that we can't rely on this study. And here I am layering on this talk, going through all these particular biases to make you realize that I hope that it takes a lot of patience and learning to go through these studies to be able to make firm conclusions, uh, and, and whether or not these are to be relied on or not. Okay, we're getting to the second half. There's also something called novelty bias, which is a tendency for an intervention to appear better when it's new. Isn't that something? When a new medicine comes out, it can be up to 30% more effective than it actually turns out to be. Think about that. Think about the interesting thing about that. Is first of all, the first set of studies is usually probably has some sort of sponsorship bias, because it could be sponsored by the pharmaceutical company. But after that, there is still this novelty bias that happens where a new intervention just tends to appear better when it's new. Now, over time, what happens is that it just sort of slowly decreases to where it actually is. It's just a funny thing with science. There are a whole host of probable things that are happening there. There could be a placebo effect that's boosting the results. But the fact is that when you see new medications, they usually outperform. Certainly, when the first generation of antidepressants came out, or the SSRIs came out, it showed that they were very, very, very effective. And then slowly over time, it lowered down. They're still effective, of course, but not as effective as because of this novelty bias. And it's just another reason why doctors, unfortunately, again, fall into this situation where you're seeing these initial results. It's a new medication. You have pharmaceutical reps that are coming in showing you the data. There's very little time for doctors who are seeing patients day in and day out to maybe they're not attending a local journal club, or they don't have time to go through it in the detail that's required, and they're seeing these great results. I've always been of the opinion, not always, but I'll tell you that in just a moment. But new medications, I'm now very, very suspicious. Not suspicious, but I realize that there's novelty bias happening and that the results aren't going to be as effective as they say. That's the first thing. And the second thing is that the amount of side effects that are reported sometimes are not completely accurate, in the sense that, maybe they've tested it on 10,000 people, but what happens to the side effect profile when 100,000 people are given it? They can't do those mega studies. So sometimes new side effects are only going to show up when a larger part of the population is given the medication. And on some occasions, those side effects that did not show up in the initial studies, even though thousands upon thousands of people were given the medication, they only showed up when a larger percentage of the population. Sometimes those medications were recalled. And I had a patient that was on a medication that early in my career, it was called Raptiva. It was for psoriasis, and I was using it. The patient had really bad erosive disease, ulcers in her mouth from another type of condition, and I gave her that medication. And then a year or two later, thankfully, she didn't have the side effects, but it was recalled. And after that, and learn, obviously, I try to continue to learn and understand things. I am hesitant to get rid of old and established medications, because sometimes it's, as they say, it's like the known how do we say it? It's like we know what we know. We know the potential negatives of medications that have been around, and we can manage them. But there are unknowns with new medications that maybe we just haven't seen yet. And I'd rather take those particular side effects that I'm aware of and can manage, as opposed to just jumping to the next newest medication that's been overhyped and it might be a stellar medication. But let's understand the novelty bias and understand the hot stuff bias that we spoke about, that we're getting this new exciting medicine and people are launching all kinds of studies that might be less sensitive and therefore not as in the long run turn out to be less effective as they are. So so those are the biases. Now let's go into false beliefs. So these are false beliefs. We're taking a detour here, although I think they're related only in the sense that we're talking about things that are things that lead us to thinking about things in the wrong way. And again, some of you may find these humorous, some of you may find them infuriating, some of you may find them insulting. I don't really know, but we'll go through them and then you'll let me know how you feel about them. Okay, let's pick one. I have a list of them in front of me. Okay. My father happens to be on, who's also a physician, wrote, "Be not the first to start the new or the last to discard the old." That's great. That's a great quote. And that sums up what I just said in one sentence instead of 5 minutes of me rambling on. Okay, so just going through them, and because we're not going to be able to go through all of them. Okay. Well, let's just go through them. So I believe, and I'm saying this as a majority of people, they may not realize that they feel this way, but ultimately they're operating on this belief. I believe that if everyone would do what I think they should do, I would be happy. I think that's one of the biggest ones, that somehow we feel as though if everyone else was behaving the way they are supposed to behave, that somehow that I would be happy. That's probably the biggest fallacy in all of life, that if everyone was doing what I thought that they should do, I would be happy. Of course, we ultimately end up realizing that happiness is not resides with ourselves first and foremost, and that if everyone would do everything that I think they should do, that would not actually yield happiness. Next is similar. I believe that I know what ought to be, and if it was that way, I would be happy. So we all believe that we think we know how every single situation would be, but ultimately it's almost like we don't like necessarily how things are, but we know we'd be happy if it were exactly as I think it should be. That's another sort of big fallacy, I believe. Again, these are all from a doctor by the name of Dr. Robert Rundell Gibson, who is a teacher, came up with all these very interesting insights about human behavior. Next one is, I believe that I am one and the same person all the time. Let's think about that for a moment. Ultimately, we have all kinds of different personalities. We have different masks we put on. We behave differently when we're hungry, when we're happy, when we're sad. And we are very much different at different parts of the time. And when we're interacting with people, we also don't necessarily recognize that people are very different. It's almost like, obviously, I believe we all have, a deep godly soul, but ultimately the light that shines through from that is filtered by having a body and a physical brain, and having moods and having beliefs. Sometimes our beliefs speak for us. I don't know how many times I'll be in an argument with someone, and then they'll just, it's almost as if it's not them that's speaking. It's this belief that they've taken on. So we vary in our personality. We're not exactly the same person all the time. Okay, next one is I believe that I have free will, but I also believe that what you do determines my feelings and behavior. I like that one. So ultimately, we feel like we have free will, but do we really have free will when other things external to us are actually determining our feelings and our behavior? I love that one. That one made me chuckle the first time I read it. I believe that I have free will, but I also believe what you do determines my feelings and behavior. And Dr. Gibson often would say something to the effect of, we use the analogy of like getting bent out of shape when somebody does something that we don't like. And being bent out of shape is like being when you're bent out of shape, when something is bent out of shape, it's a thing. It's it's a machine that's bent out of shape. And when a human being becomes a machine, that's sort of perverse. It's like a perversity of our nature. And so therefore, when we think about free will, uh, ultimately, we don't have as much free will. We have the capability of having free will, but ultimately we don't have free will if the things around us are determining our behavior. And it always reminds me of a situation, not a story that that's in Hebrew tradition, where a person goes to this master and says, I really want to study with you. And he said, I just have a few questions for you. And the first question is, how do you feel when someone praises you? And the person says, well, I feel wonderful when someone praises me. And then he asks the second question. He says, how do you feel when someone insults you? And he says, I feel terrible. I feel horrible. And the master says to him, when the response to both of those is exactly the same, then you can come back and you can study with me. And so I think that I like that story only because it shows a presence of mind that is indicative of a state of free will, where we're not determined by the things that surround us or the people that are around us. We don't get bent out of shape and become a machine with no free will. We are able to make those decisions on ourselves, by ourselves. Next is, I believe if a statement is logical, it must be true. And of course, this is something that we see quite a bit. Probably Jennifer here, who has some background in, I believe, probably in some kind of science in this regard, would have some opinions on. Just because something is logical doesn't make it true. Like, years ago, remember they saw the face on Mars. I don't know if you remember this. There was, I think it was in the 70s, the first, there were these pictures from Mars, and it looked exactly like a human face. And when you looked at it, you're like, there could be no doubt in your mind that wow, there is this possibility that maybe an ancient civilization built this thing. I mean, it looked exactly like a face. And it would be logical, in fact, to make that conclusion, because there were people who had analyzed, the ratio between the eyes and the nose and all these things that sort of made sense, like, wow, and in a way it would actually be logical. But when they were actually able to get much better images, it doesn't look anything like a face. So you require an abundance of evidence to be able to make to convert something into a fact. There can be lots of logical conclusions made. Sherlock Holmes could make lots of logical conclusions, but that doesn't necessarily mean, that the butler did it, or whatever the case may be. Okay, coming to the end, one that I mentioned earlier, I believe in my present state, I can understand any book printed in the language I speak, write, and read. And this one is, I really believe that a lot of people have this opinion. A lot of people know that there are things that are difficult to understand, or whatever the case may be, but ultimately they end up citing information that shows that they don't really have a clear understanding of what they read. So this is another belief that people have. Another thing that people do in that regard is they'll read an article that they didn't really understand, and then when they are called to, when there's an argument that takes place, that instead of arguing what the article might have said, as one of their backups, they'll just send you they'll say, oh, read this article, it'll explain it. Well, probably you didn't understand the article to begin with. If you understood the article, then you would have explained it. So that's something, with all the volume of information that we have, this is one of the things people tend to not actually go into detail. They just pull confirmation bias. Here's an article that supports this and this and this without really spending hardly any time really thinking about things. Okay, almost getting to the end. Here's one that definitely has pervaded our political landscape over the last several years. I believe that my opinions are correct, and that if you do not agree with them, that you're either poorly informed or simply stupid. I think that could be said for both sides of the political spectrum, thinking that the other side, and just saying that their opinions are correct. If you do not agree with them, you're either poorly informed or simply stupid. This is written by Dr. Robert Rundell Gibson, probably in the 80s, in the 1980s. Here's another good one. Hopefully you're enjoying these. I believe that if I struggle on in my present state, that finally everything will work out as I want it to. This one's very difficult for some people because they feel as though the struggle that they're continuing is just somehow eventually going to work out exactly as they want it. As we've spoken about many times before, obviously the future is completely uncertain. But I think one of the things that he's referring to here is basically that as there was one rabbi by the name of Jonathan Sachs used to say, the meaning of a problem exists outside of the problem, and therefore the solution oftentimes is coming from outside the problem. And Einstein also said that a problem, I'm not going to get the quote exactly right, but the solution to a problem, it comes from a higher order of thinking. I don't remember exactly what that quote is. It's something like, I can't remember the exact quote, but something to that effect, that you really need to be able to look at things from a different perspective, elevating your perspective in order to analyze the struggle that you're in, and to make sure that you're seeing a deeper meaning and a higher perspective from it. And finally, the last one, I could go on, there are dozens of these, is I believe that I'm capable of judging others and that my judgment of them is fair and accurate. And unfortunately, in modern society now, especially social media, it's all about making rapid judgments. And unfortunately, as these judgments get posted and they accumulate over time, then the other biases tend to take place, such as confirmation bias. In other words, when someone is maligned fairly or unfairly, then you have all these people who continue to attack the person with all these comments, and then there's confirmation bias of the conclusion that may be drawn. Because look, you have all these people coming out saying, making the exact same judgment, which may or may not be correct, and is not because you're making a decision, but you're relying on the probably misinformed or faulty judgments of others, and using confirmation bias to continue to assemble evidence that this person is what they say. And this, of course, is something that's happening to a frightening degree. And I think ultimately, certainly, all of you are aware of the statements of Jesus as an example to not judge. All traditions have a very similar stance, and ultimately, we aren't capable of making very, very firm judgments. And there's a whole host of biases that happen in terms of just plain old observation. We all see things through completely different lenses, and that influences the way we see things. So we are not capable of making really good judgments, and our judgments are often not fair and accurate, but we act and behave as if we are capable of doing that, which then leads to, as to sort of bring this full circle to a conclusion. And once that conclusion takes place, all thought stops, and we're no longer able to be convinced of anything. We've made our decision. We, through confirmation bias, have all of these things that support it, and then, unfortunately, no further thought takes place. Hopefully, after hearing about all the different ways that we can get confused and led astray by nature of being in human bodies with brains that are fallible, with histories that have given us certain lenses. There was a quote that I actually heard today on a podcast that I'm not going to remember completely. Oh, it was a quote by William Blake, and the quote was something to the effect that I think it was William Blake, that something to the effect that you know what, I can't remember, but it was basically something to the effect that heaven is just a change of glasses, or something to that effect. That, you know, we are seeing things through a very particular set of lenses, and therefore that set of lenses is, you know, composed of all these different biases, ways we've grown up, and beliefs that we've internalized that we may not even have realized that we've internalized. That's why I certainly liked Dr. Gibson's set, and combining them with all these scientific cognitive biases. So thank you for your attention. I think this was, again, one of those experimental episodes where we sort of veered in various directions, and I'm certainly so pleased that all of you stuck around. Thank you, David, for making me smile. We spoke about chocolate chip cookies and my absolute weakness to them at a previous class, and David's been trying to get me to laugh on camera, no doubt. And Jennifer, thank you for that very well thought out statement. I appreciate it. I hope to see you again on our classes. And to everyone else, thank you again for your attention. And I look forward to seeing you next Wednesday night, 8 p.m. for episode 71. Wish everyone good health. And again, thank you again for your attention, and look forward to seeing you then.